Is it? Hello, everyone. I think we are recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. As always, quick reminder, because in the beginning, everyone pays attention. Join me on locals, follow me on Instagram, join my mailing list, support down below links if you choose to, zero pressure, but if yes, thank you very much. Today, I am joined again by Scott Ritter, who I absolutely love connecting with, and my audience after our last conversation was very, very, very appreciative of what Scott was saying and expressing, and I'm very glad that Scott found time again to connect with me while I am still in Russia. So welcome back, Scott.
Thanks for having me. I apologize for my dress, but the Miami Dolphins got into the playoffs for the first time in 6 years, so I'm celebrating.
Okay, that explains. I didn't ask about this, but now we know. If someone will be wondering, today I have two questions that are actually pretty long, but I really want to read this because I think that will give a lot of information to the audience, and I would like you to hear it, Scott, and then we get to the question. So at the end of last year, 2022, on the official YouTube channel of the Polish Ministry of National Defense appeared a video that was titled "Polish Army Strong as Ever." In that video, that actually looked like a promo, almost like a trailer of some kind of American movie, let's say, it was shown what purchases were made by Poland or will be made to strengthen the Polish army. And I have to read this now to then ask you a question. So the summary of this is over 160,000 soldiers under arms, including 36,000 soldiers of the Territorial Defense Forces. Now we go to the equipment. Patriot systems, K2 tanks, K9 howitzers, and I apologize for mispronunciations, Bayraktar drones, Komoran mine hunters 2, Krab howitzers, mortar scanners, lightning kits, Pili cassettes, AW101 helicopters, AW149 helicopters, Chum launchers, Heimer launchers, plane F-35, planes FA-50, Abrams tanks, observation satellites. Here is my question. What kind of army is that in your expertise?
Well, I mean, first of all, we need to know the quantities. I have a basic understanding that Poland is, they just announced that they are going to be forming up a new armored division. So, you know, we're talking, 15,000, 20,000 men, depending on how they organize it. So that'll be hundreds of tanks, scores of artillery systems, et cetera. So, what kind of army is it? It's a modern army. It's an army that's capable of engaging in, combined arms operations. It sounds like they're configuring it for large-scale ground combat in Europe, as opposed to creating an expeditionary force to go off and fight terrorism around the world. It's under normal circumstances, every nation has an inherent right for self-defense, and Poland likewise has an inherent right for self-defense. And if you're going to create a military, you're a fool if you're not trying to create the most modern, capable military. There's no reason to put men and women under arms if you're not going to give them the very best equipment money can buy. So I'm not worried about the equipment per se. I'm worried about the policies behind it, the impetus behind it. What is the purpose of this? And we know what the purpose is. The purpose is to build a military capable of engaging in combat operations with the Russian military. Poland is trying to set the stage, so to speak, for any potential future conflict with Russia. The Poles understand the reality of having the military that they currently have, which is a military that's not up to the task. The Polish military can't be counted on to survive a sustained war with a nation like Russia. And because of that, Poland increases the cost associated with reinforcing Poland. The United States would have, has put a core level headquarters in Poland. The implication there is at least three divisions of troops would be deployed. Those three divisions are not sufficient to defeat Russia in and of themselves. They would have to be integrated into a NATO structure, which, because it's on Polish soil, would be built around the Polish army. And for the United States today to rely on Poland in any major ground conflict with Russia is like Nazi Germany relying on the Italians and the Hungarians and the Romanians in the 1942-1943 campaign in southern Russia. You can't rely on them. They will be defeated. They're not equipped properly. They're not organized properly. They're not led properly. And as what happened in World War II, the Soviets were able to rout the Italians, rout the Hungarians, rout the Romanians, and the German forces were isolated. This is what would happen to the United States if it were to engage in large-scale ground combat with Russia using Poland as an ally. The Polish army would melt away, be defeated, and the United States would be isolated and ultimately destroyed. What Poland is doing is saying, no, no, no. We're building a capable military. We're building a modern Western military. We're building a military that can operate side by side with an American force or another NATO force. And in doing so, Poland is lessening the cost of American assistance to Poland or American intervention to Poland. And on the one hand, people would say, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? And I'd say no, because what you're doing is actually making the potential for war more likely, because you're creating the conditions where people think, aha, we can engage the Russians and we can engage them with at least an expectation of victory. I would prefer NATO to say, we don't want to engage the Russians, but even if they say we want to, I'd prefer a situation where they'd say we're not capable of engaging, because I know that the Russia's not looking to invade NATO. I'm not worried about the Russians. I think the world makes a mistake when they think of this expansive Russia that wants to take territory here, there, and everywhere. Ukraine is a unique set of circumstances that's linked to, NATO expansion, the irresponsibility of the Ukrainian government, the threats posed to Russia, et cetera. But the same conditions don't exist regarding Poland or Romania or Moldova or the Baltics. Russia's not seeking to invade, occupy, and absorb. So it doesn't make any sense for Poland to build a military capable of offensive operations against Russia. It's very destabilizing. Now, I could understand if they, again, modernize your military by all means. I believe every nation should. If you're going to have a military, it should be capable of defending you. But I understand the reasons why Poland is doing this. It's not for defensive operations. It's to create the potential for offensive combat against Russia. And that's a very dangerous thing.
So on that note, I want to ask you this. It's actually great because this takes me perfectly to my second question. Another long question. Observing the actions of the Polish government, Polish-speaking government, I emphasize here, especially the Prime Minister and the President, which in my opinion are caused not only by ignorance, selfishness, but also by the influence of the American government or a group of people that is still trying to rule the world and presents them with one-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get to a huge money. I wonder if Poland can actually trigger Putin to the point when he will use the nuclear weapon.
No, I don't believe so. And I'll say it this way. I'll answer it this way. The Russians are a very mature nation, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. They don't make idle threats. If you take a look at the growth of Russia's nuclear capability in the past decade, it's singularly driven by the irresponsibility of the United States when it comes to arms control, and the way the United States has destroyed the very foundations of arms control that had created some limitations around the nuclear enterprise of both nations. We got rid of the ABM treaty, anti-ballistic missile treaty, thereby destabilizing the security of Europe and indeed the world by forward deploying missile defense systems in Poland and Romania. Now every one of our Aegis ships is considered to be an anti-missile platform, and we have them based in Spain. We deploy them into the Arctic, onto the Barents Sea. We deploy them into the Black Sea. We're surrounding Russia with this anti-ballistic missile capability. And we got rid of the INF treaty. We backed out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which basically, in my opinion, saved Europe and the world from nuclear apocalypse back in the 1980s. We were headed straight towards hell back then, but the treaty prevented it. That treaty's gone because of the United States, and now we're seeking to deploy a new intermediate range missiles into Europe. I mean, basically recreating the same insanity that existed back in the 80s. I mean, the Russians are aware of all this, and so they are, of course, responding. And Russia has, they have a nuclear posture which prohibits the use of nuclear weapons unless Russia's been attacked by nuclear weapons. Or if a conventional threat materializes that threatens the very existence of Russia, then Russia would use nuclear weapons to save itself. Poland, let's talk about the potential threat Poland could pose to Russia that could trigger a nuclear conflict. In order for Poland to do this, Poland would, one thing Poland could do is allow NATO nuclear weapons or American nuclear weapons to be stored on Polish soil. There's been some talk about this, both from the American side and the Polish government, but it's a NATO decision. So I don't imagine NATO would go along with something that provocative, but it is a threat. It is a concern. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future regarding Europe's continued willingness to keep the B-61 bombs, nuclear bombs, American bombs that are allocated or set aside for use by NATO nations in a conflict. There's some talk within Germany that Germany may not want to continue to have these weapons on their soil. If that's the case, where would these weapons go? And there's been talk that they could go to Poland. That would be a very provocative measure, would be forward deploying nuclear weapons into Polish soil. But even that alone isn't going to trigger a Russian nuclear response. It just means that Russia will now target Poland with its nuclear arsenal, so to guarantee that Poland disappears if there ever is a nuclear conflict. So good job, Poland. But the other threat would be if Poland, together with NATO, created an offensive strike capability that could threaten, say, Moscow or St. Petersburg or, Russia itself, and then acted on it in a way that made it difficult for Russia to defend itself, maybe a preemptive strike, things of this nature. That could trigger a Russian nuclear response. Fortunately, while Poland is working to build up one division, and probably more down the road, the number they talked about increasing was 160,000 troops. That's, roughly, half a dozen divisions or more. Russia just signed a bill. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, just signed a bill that authorizes the expansion of the Russian military to 1.5 million men. They're going to begin an increase in conscription, as well as offering a larger number of contracts for professional soldiers. They're expanding dramatically their airborne forces, their marine forces. These are forces, expeditionary forces that can be deployed anywhere on the Russian periphery. Artillery divisions, they're expanding those. They're building a whole new battle group opposite of Finland. A new, they're weaponizing and making a new military district to oppose the potential expansion of Finland and Sweden. They're beefing up their other areas, and they're ramping up their defense industry to support this. So Russia's well ahead of NATO already on this. So I don't think the threat of a conventional attack against Russia will ever materialize because the Russians are just, they're too smart, too savvy, and too strong. The nuclear, the potential posed by putting nuclear bombs on Polish soil, continuing to, expand the Aegis Ashore missile defense system in Poland that has dual use capabilities. You can fire Tomahawks or these new Typhoon missiles that are built to be fired from this. This is destabilizing. And here's the risk. And Poland may not even intend to do this, but when you take a look at the plans of the United States to deploy the Dark Eagle hypersonic missile system into Europe, and you have these missile defense systems that can be converted into offensive strike platforms like the Aegis Ashore, you create the potential for misunderstanding, for a mistake to be made. You see, the Russians aren't going to allow the West to carry out a preemptive strike that decapitates their leadership or somehow neutralizes their nuclear strike enterprise. Vladimir Putin has said, because the United States and indeed the West are considering developing the technologies that could lead to preemptive strike, that Russia is not only going to increase its readiness when it comes to what they call launch on detection. See, Russia says we're not going to use nuclear weapons unless you fire nuclear weapons at us. But Putin has made it very clear that doesn't mean that we wait for the nuclear weapon to hit us. When we detect the firing of nuclear weapons, we launch everything and we all die. He said, we will not be the first to use nuclear weapons, but we won't be the second. And so that's a very dangerous situation inherently. But normally when you have launch on detection, because of the way strategic systems are, the ranges they operate at, they take, anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes to reach their target, which means, let's say there was an accidental launch, or if there was a mistake made, that gives people time to get on the phone and talk about it and work through a solution that doesn't lead to the total annihilation of the world. But with Dark Eagle, if there's a mistake, we've taken that 30 to 40 minute window and we've turned it into 5 to 7 minutes. That's not enough time. And so, the Russian leadership can't even get down into a bunker at that point in time. So, if Vladimir Putin's in the Kremlin and bam, boss, they just fired Dark Eagle, we have a salvo coming in, headed towards Moscow, Putin's just going to say, launch everything, launch everything. And Poland is contributing to this because of their irresponsible rhetoric regarding nuclear weapons. Poland should literally take the stance that let's get rid of all nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons don't secure Poland. All nuclear weapons do is guarantee Poland's destruction, total destruction under any scenario, and create the potential for global thermonuclear conflict. And so I think the Polish are just horribly irresponsible. If you're going to be a frontline state, be a responsible frontline state. Again, I'm not singing the praises of Germany, but I will say this. During the Cold War, the Germans took a look at NATO nuclear posture. And what NATO was planning to do is if the Soviets ever came across the border and were driving on the Rhine River, NATO wanted to fall back and use nuclear weapons to slow down the Soviet advance. And the Germans went, you guys do understand that when you say use nuclear weapons, you're dropping them on German soil, German towns, German cities. And therefore, even if we win the war, Germany will no longer be a viable country because it'll be a nuclear wasteland. So what the Germans said is we want to have a forward defense. We want to defend conventionally the very borders. We don't want to trade space and use nuclear weapons. And that was a responsible position to take because it reduced the initial threshold for the use of nuclear weapons in case of any potential conflict. So that nuclear weapons weren't the first option. They became the last option. That's what Poland should be seeking to do. Poland should be seeking to reduce the threshold. And one way to do that is to build a modern army, is to build an army capable of engaging in a fight and not having to have nuclear weapons come and save the day. So on the one hand, that's good. And if Poland was doing that and at the same time articulating a desire for general nuclear disarmament, I'd say that's a responsible policy. I could buy into that policy. But that's not what Poland's doing. They're talking about increasing their offensive conventional strike capability. At the same time, they're facilitating the nuclearization of NATO's posture in regard to this forward-leaning presence. And that becomes a threat that Russia can't ignore. And Russia would be more inclined to preempt nuclear in a nuclear fashion if there was ever this kind of mistake.
I'm speechless because I don't even know what to say, about how they are running Poland right now. Scott, you actually mentioned this. It's interesting because that was my third question for you about this Dark Eagle. So the United States Army intends to deploy this long-range hypersonic weapon. Can you tell me, and you said a few things about it already, when they are planning to do it, what this really does, and are they planning to use it in Ukraine?
Well, I think in 2021, they activated, problem with getting old as your memory goes, but I think it's the 53rd Artillery Brigade, which was the artillery brigade that existed during the Cold War for the Pershing II missile. And so it's an artillery brigade with a reputation, because the Pershing II is the exact same kind of weapon. It wasn't hypersonic, but if you fired a Pershing II from West German soil, it was going to hit Moscow in 12 minutes. And that's what created the sense of danger regarding potential nuclear conflict that led to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty to get rid of the Pershing II and the SS-20 because they were destabilizing weapons. I mean, it's amazing how people forget their history. That's why I wrote a book, by the way. I don't want to promote it too much, but Disarmament at the Time of Perestroika is about that very story, about the threat these weapons posed and what we did to get rid of these weapons. But it's like nobody remembers that history. Nobody remembers how stupid those policies were and why we had to get rid of those weapons with a treaty because how dangerous they were. Instead, it's like some Cold Warrior or somebody with a Cold War fantasy fetish said, let's reactivate the 53rd Artillery Brigade, ha, 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 and we're going to give it the Dark Eagle, which is a weapon that's even faster than the Pershing II. Will show those Russians. But don't you understand that the Russians don't sit back and do nothing? The Russians are preparing a response to this capability. And that response is not going to be one that seeks parity, but one that will guarantee an outcome favorable to Russia, which leads then us to escalate and say, well, no, we can't let the Russians have the upper hand, so we need to escalate. The Dark Eagle was supposed to be deployed I believe, in the summer of 2022. They may have actually deployed certain components of the system, not the missile, but the launchers and vehicles, so that people could get used to driving them and maintaining them and operating them. But the missile itself hasn't been perfected yet. They still need to make sure that it works. The United States is having some difficulty with hypersonics. And so they pushed that off, and some people said it's going to be deployed this year, this summer. Now there's some talk that it won't be ready till 2024. So we don't know exactly when the system's going to come in. What I would hope would happen is that, like the deployment, the INF talks, Intermediate Nuclear Forces talks, were already underway before the United States deployed version 2 and ground-launched cruise missile. But the only way we could get the Soviets to agree to get rid of all of their intermediate nuclear forces, especially the SS-20 road mobile missile, was for us to put something on the table to get rid of too. Unfortunately, that's just the way the game goes. It wasn't though we'd say, hey, look, we won't deploy these missiles if you get rid of yours, because the Russians are saying, well, we built them, we deployed them, and you're want us to get rid of them, and everything's free for you. So the United States had to build them, deploy them, and now we could draw down equally. The Dark Eagle is a stupid weapon system. It gives no advantages to anybody. It's a suicide weapon. It can't ever be used. It can't ever be used. And let me just make that point, because you made the question, would it be used in Ukraine? No, of course not. If it was, first of all, the second it's launched, Russia has to assume that it's a nuclear warhead coming at Moscow. Russia's not going to sit there and say, let's see what happens. Because remember, one of the things about hypersonics is that it's not a ballistic missile. It's a maneuvering missile. So it can fire up, come down, go this way, maneuver in. The idea is to avoid air defense systems. So its initial trajectory may not be indicative of its ultimate target. So one has to assume the worst upon detection of launch. And you fire the Dark Eagle, Russia's going to immediately assume that you're striking Moscow, and then Russia will respond accordingly. So the Dark Eagle can never be used. That's the stupidity of the system. You're building a system that can never be used. So hopefully sanity will prevail. And once the system is deployed, Russia and the United States will begin negotiating INF-2, a new treaty to get rid of these systems, get rid of the Dark Eagle, and get rid of whatever equivalent systems the Russians may have or may seek to build in response, and eliminate intermediate nuclear weapon systems from the lexicon of European defense. Europe should never be allowed to have any intermediate range missiles because of the proximity of Russia with Europe. Intermediate range forces puts everybody at immediate risk of global annihilation.
So it's another waste of the taxpayers' money.
Yeah, of course. It's just stupid. It's just a ridiculous weapon system.
So 2 more questions, Scott. Maybe 3 we see. But first is, I wonder, where would we be as the world if Russia, Putin, didn't take that action on February 24th?
Well, we now know, it's no longer speculation. We now know that Ukraine was working with NATO to build up a military capable of launching offensive military action against the Donbass and potentially onto Crimea. We know this. It's no longer speculative. We have Angela Merkel, we have Hollande, we have Poroshenko all admitting Minsk was a sham to buy time for the Ukrainian military to be built up. And we have the United States and NATO putting in at least three major training facilities. The United States bragged that theirs was designed to train a battalion of Ukrainian forces every 55 days. Almost 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers were trained by the US during this time. Another 30, 40, 50,000 were trained by NATO. This is an 80,000 strong NATO strike force. It's trained specifically to fight the Russians. And we know that these forces were being accumulated in Eastern Ukraine prior to the Russian action. And B, in the lead up to the Russian action, the Ukrainians had begun a dramatic increase in the amount of attacks that they were doing on the Donbass, on Lugansk and Donetsk. Thousands of mortars and artillery rounds were being fired. The Organization for Security in Europe, observers, detected this. And when you take a look at their reports about the violations, the overwhelming number of violations were conducted by the Ukrainian side. And then we have Zelensky bragging to his own inner circle how our policy is war, our policy is war, our policy is war. So had Russia not intervened, one thing people don't realize is that the militias of Lugansk and Donetsk had actually been reduced to the bare minimum necessary to man the front lines. They went from having 30, 40, 50,000 people to having 10,000. And had they been attacked by 80, 90, 100,000 well-armed, well-trained, well-equipped Ukrainian forces, they would not have been able to defend. And so the Ukrainians could very well have taken or recaptured all of the Donbass, and then made a move on Crimea, which would have put them in direct conflict with Russia. And that, what could have led to, a different kind of war. Because now I think Russia would have definitely linked the Ukrainian actions to NATO. And we could very easily have seen this become a general war between Russia and NATO. So Russia actually saved the world by invading Ukraine on February 24th, because had Russia not done this, then Ukraine and NATO, I believe, would have carried out in the near term, probably in March of 2022, precipitous offensive operations that would have inevitably dragged Russia into the conflict, but in a way they didn't have. See, Russia, when they called it the special military operation, Russia created the four corners that contain this operation to Ukraine. They specifically designed the operation with that in mind. The Ukrainians, with their NATO backing, because remember, it's not Ukraine acting alone. We now have the admission of Merkel and Hollande that it was the policy to build the Ukrainian military. And we now have the Ukrainian Minister of Defense bragging about the role Ukraine is playing as the tool of NATO. He says, we are doing your job. We're doing your job. We're fighting the Russians on your behalf. He's stating it in the open. Why? Because that was always the policy. And had Ukraine initiated the conflict, these four corners that limit the conflict that Russia has put in play wouldn't exist. And this very well could have spun out into, and would have spun out into, a general war between Russia and NATO that would have gone nuclear. So, I know it sounds like Russian propaganda, but, I'm just telling you right now, the world should be thankful that Russia did what it did, because as bad as things are in Ukraine, the way Russia has conducted itself, nobody is looking for a NATO versus Russia conflict. But had Ukraine been allowed to launch the actions with the backing of NATO, it would have ended up with a Russia-NATO conflict.
So Scott, let me ask you this now, because I was thinking about it actually quite a lot in regards to, there will come a day when this is over and there will be peace agreement and there will be the end to that fighting. But now looking at those Minsk agreements that were just not honest, how any peace agreement can be ever taken seriously and respected? It's just my common sense. I'm trying to look at this, how you can ever make peace and trust that this will be respected and this peace will prevail.
The short answer is you can't. Let me start off by saying this. I'm not a Russian negotiator. I don't work for the Russian Foreign Ministry. I definitely don't work for Vladimir Putin's inner circle. I don't know what the national priorities of Russia are, and what Russia would be willing to do to achieve a peaceful resolution to this problem. But I'll just go off of what Russia has said. Vladimir Putin has said that he made a mistake in allowing 2014 Minsk Accord to go forward. That, a lot of people don't realize it wasn't just a ceasefire, it was a ceasefire to save the Ukrainian army. That the Ukrainian army was surrounded by pro-Russian forces, 10,000 troops surrounded, and they were going to be annihilated. They were on the verge of being annihilated. And that the purpose of the 2014 ceasefire was to save these forces. And Putin has said, I made a mistake. I trusted the West. I should never have. We could have finished it then. And they could have. They could have wiped out the Ukrainian army and it would have been over, finished. He said, I won't make that mistake again, meaning that he's not, what that means is Russia can never allow this conflict to end with the Ukrainian army in the field. The Ukrainian army must be destroyed. That's what demilitarization means. That's been one of the Russian stated objectives since day one. The other thing is Russia can't allow, there's been a lot of talk in the West about what they call the Korea solution, to create a situation where you have a demilitarized zone separating the Ukrainians from the Russians. And the Russians are like, we could never do this because that allows this cancer that is the Zelensky regime, that is the Ukrainian nationalists that have dominated Ukraine, to continue to exist. And we will be in a state of perpetual war, which is the exact opposite direction Russia wanted to take when they started speaking about a new European security framework. The idea was to create a framework of perpetual peace, not perpetual war. So I can't imagine Russia buying into something that radically departs from its strategic objective of a new European security framework. So this means that Russia can't end this conflict with the Zelensky government intact. So we'll have to defeat Ukraine. So now, if we recognize these two objectives as still representing the Russian purpose for this conflict, demilitarization, denazification, under what conditions will Ukraine agree to this? And the answer is never, ever. So negotiations are absurd. I mean, it's just the basic thought of negotiations are an absurdity, and we see that because they're talking past one another. The Russians keep saying we're open to negotiations, but on realistic terms, which means Russia's not giving up territories that have been incorporated into Russia by Article 64 of the Russian Constitution. That is, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea are permanently part of Russia. They will never give these up. Moreover, Russia will not allow a situation where the Ukrainian military is within at least 100 kilometers of this border, because Russia is not going to allow the Ukrainians to fire artillery shells into Russian cities. So, Ukraine, in addition to giving up these territories, is going to have a demilitarized buffer zone imposed on it. Ukraine's not going to sign on to that willingly. So we have two sides talking past one another. Ukraine with their unrealistic things. We'll have negotiations if Russia turns over all the territories and then agrees to war crimes investigations against Putin and his generals. Russia's never going to accept that. Russia's saying we need Ukraine to give us all these territories we've already taken, push back, demilitarize, denazify, and Ukraine's never going to do that. So the only negotiation that will ultimately take place is one that I liken to what took place in Tokyo Bay in September of 1945, where the Americans gathered on the deck of the USS Missouri, a battleship, and brought the defeated Japanese generals and politicians on board to sit down and sign a document written by the United States, unconditional surrender. And that's how this is going to end, in my opinion. It's going to end when somebody representing the Ukrainian government, not Zelensky, will sit down with the Russians and sign a document written by the Russians for unconditional surrender. Now, what are the terms of this unconditional surrender to be? I think Ukraine does have a say in this. I think that and we may have talked about this before, Vladimir Putin did one of his Valdai discussions back in October, November timeframe. And a Hungarian journalist asked him about Odessa. I think it was a tongue-in-cheek question. Odessa is a beautiful city. When should I visit Odessa? And Putin sort of joked back, said that the sooner the better. But then he said something. I'll just condense it, but it basically that Odessa was the key to either the peaceful resolution of this crisis or the key to Russia's total victory. And that'll be up to Ukraine. One thing I've learned studying the Russian president is that he doesn't speak idly. He doesn't just throw out empty words. He's not an American politician, by the way. So when he speaks, there's generally a purpose behind his words. So, and I've spoken on other podcasts about this. I call it the Odessa moment. And I think that we're going to see Russia develop the battlefield in a way that guarantees its initial geographic outcome, meaning all of the 4 territories are secured with a buffer zone, probably securing the totality of at least Kharkov Oblast, but maybe some others. Nikolaev Oblast probably will be secured, but it'll put Russia on the cusp of moving on Odessa. And at that point in time, I think Russia will offer Ukraine terms of surrender. Unconditional. It's not a debate. It's not a discussion. It's not a dialogue. It's if you stop now, you still have Odessa. Now, Russia may come up with some special conditions for Odessa, meaning maybe make it a joint city, something of that nature, but Ukraine will have access to the sea, which changes everything in terms of the future economic direction Ukraine can take in a post-war environment. Having access to the sea, direct access to the sea, gives Ukraine tremendous potential. If Ukraine becomes a landlocked nation, losing a great deal of its industrial capacity, it's a completely different kind of nation. So I think Russia will offer Ukraine the opportunity to surrender unconditionally at that point. Ukraine, I believe, will reject it. And then Russia will take Odessa, link up with Transnistria, and destroy Ukraine as a modern nation state. But there will be no negotiated settlement here. This is the point I'm trying to make. The West cannot be trusted as a negotiating partner. Russia will never again trust the West to intervene on behalf of Ukraine, and Russia can't afford to allow Ukraine to exist in its current iteration. Ukraine is a cancer for Russia, cancer for Ukraine, cancer for Europe, and it must be excised. The tumor must be removed, and Russia is going to remove it. It's up to Ukraine to determine whether or not they want to go in for the least painful surgery or go in for the most intrusive surgery. It's up to Ukraine. That's the only leverage Ukraine has on this is, how much of Ukraine do they want to retain? Ironically, if they stop the war today, they'd be in the best position because they get to retain a lot of Ukraine. But they're not going to stop the war. They're insisting that the West provide them weaponry. They're going to extend this war, this conflict. So Russia, because they've expanded the conflict, Russia will expand the scope and scale of its response. And I don't believe this thing stops until Russia literally, physically controls all of what is traditionally referred to as Novorossiya or Southern Russia. I think Putin will give Ukraine and the West, because here's another important thing. The Russians have always, I believe, operated with escalation management in mind. They haven't operated precipitously. They haven't done anything that has been overly provocative in terms of threatening NATO. We have Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, Borrell, and other European officials talking about how the war in Ukraine is an existential war for Europe, and that a NATO defeat in Ukraine or a Ukrainian defeat against the Russians is a defeat for NATO, a defeat for Europe. So when you have politicians, staking out that position, there's pressure, therefore, to respond if you see the situation getting out of control. So I think Russia, rather than rushing to a precipitous victory and confronting NATO in an aggressive fashion with the inevitability of the fall of Odessa, et cetera, therefore creating the potential for NATO to say, we need to act now to stop this. Russia will take a pause. I call it the Odessa pause, the Odessa moment, and give both Europe, NATO, and Ukraine the option for peace. And at that point in time, I believe you're going to see Europe, NATO, and Ukraine come together. They're not going to be able to accept the terms, but it at least creates that political pause so that when Russia does continue its strike, there won't be panic that requires intervention into southern Ukraine, et cetera. Russia is not seeking a conflict with NATO. And I think Russia will unfold its operations in a manner that minimizes the potential for conflict with NATO. Again, Vladimir Putin is the only adult in the room. That's just a statement of fact.
So there is this potential on the ship somewhere near Odessa of having that agreement of surrender around, let's say, September. And
I think
if it
so.
doesn't, and if
I
it
think
does,
so. Yeah.
if it doesn't happen, then there is a different ending to it.
A very different ending, a very violent ending, a very tragic ending. Look, all of this is tragic. I mean, this whole thing's tragic. I keep trying to tell American audiences, because I sometimes am accused of being too glib or too optimistic when I talk about the casualty disparity. I focus on the high level of Ukrainian casualties. But what people don't understand is that, if the Russians are, achieving a 1 to 5, 1 to 8, 1 to 10 casualty ratio, meaning for every Russian lost, there's 5 Ukrainians lost, 8 Ukrainians lost, 10 Ukrainians. Say on average it's 8. If the Ukrainians lose 800 men, that means Russia lost 100. So if Ukraine's losing 800 men a day, Russia's losing 100 men a day. The United States lost its will to continue the Vietnam War because we were losing 200, 220 men a week at the height of the Vietnam conflict. If the casualty figures we're talking about are accurate, Russia's losing 700 men a week, nearly more than 3 times the number that broke the American will to fight. So let's not pretend that Russia isn't suffering, that Russia isn't paying a price. Russia's paying a horrible, horrible price. There are Russian families that are losing their husbands, losing their fathers, losing their brothers. I mean, losing their cousins, their uncles, their nephews, as are the Ukrainians. I mean, it's the same thing, but we tend to focus on the Ukrainian casualties because they're just so mind-bendingly big. What's happening in Ukraine is just an absolute gut-wrenching horror. But and we think, well, therefore Russia is winning. But winning comes with a cost, a horrible, horrible cost. And if people don't think that weighs on the minds of Russian leadership, Vladimir Putin is not a robot. He's not a machine. He's a human being. And, he's a good leader, I believe, for Russia. He's a decisive leader, but he's a leader that is fully cognizant of the human toll this war is taking. And so imagine how, I was going to use a bad word. I stopped myself. How damn frustrated he must be to live in a world where, because of the irresponsibilities of the West, they've taken the potential of negotiating an early termination of this conflict. I believe Russia would like to negotiate a viable end to this conflict. Why? So that more Russian boys don't die. I mean, it's a huge imperative. The Russians aren't callous to this. They're not indifferent to this. They don't want this war. They don't want it. And so imagine just the absolute, put yourself in the shoes of the Russian leadership, knowing what you have to do to win, knowing what must be done, and knowing the price that you're going to have to pay to accomplish this, and knowing you're not being given any other option. It's, weaker men would become alcoholics or drug users because of this. It's that kind of depressing reality. And again, the world owes the Russian leadership debt of gratitude because they're not overreacting. You don't want someone like me in a position of leadership because I am a revenge-minded son of a gun. I would be so angry, so overwhelmed with fury that I would unleash the dogs of war. Hell hath no fury, like a man who has witnessed the people he trained die on a battlefield that didn't need to happen. I watch these allegedly pro-Russian bloggers out there attack Putin, and attack the Russian leadership as cowards, as weak, as this, as that. And I have nothing but absolute disgust for them, nothing but disgust. First of all, they don't shoulder the burden of leadership, the burden of command. They don't make the decisions that result in people dying. Every time Putin meets with his leadership, and you have a general draw a line on a map and say, sir, I think we should do this. That line equates into thousands of deaths. It's not just, sir, we should do this. It's, sir, I need you to sign off an order that's going to kill thousands of Russian soldiers. Okay, all these bloggers don't have that burden. They don't have that burden of command, the burden of leadership. Putin does. And he's doing a good job. Is it a perfect job? No, because people aren't perfect. Humans aren't perfect. We all make mistakes, but he's not making mistakes of a magnitude to threaten Russia. He's making the decisions that not only, I believe, will end up with a Russian victory, but he's also making decisions that increase the harm done to the Russian military because he doesn't want this conflict to grow out of control and to bring NATO in. So he is sacrificing Russian lives so that the world can survive. And so again, I don't mean to overplay this, but someday the history will be written of this conflict. And if they don't give Vladimir Putin the damn Nobel Peace Prize, the way he's managed this conflict, then that prize has no value whatsoever, none whatsoever. Because ironically speaking, the biggest man of peace in the world today is Vladimir Putin. This is a war he did not want to fight. This is a war he tried desperately to avoid fighting. This is a war that was brought onto him by Western duplicity. It's not theoretical duplicity, Anya. We know what we're talking about. Merkel, Hollande, Biden, everybody lied to him. They lied because they were pursuing a military option using Ukraine. We have the Ukrainian Minister of Defense bragging about this. So everybody's sitting there attacking Putin as this warmonger, this man who carried out an unprovoked act of aggression. No, he had no choice. He had no choice but to do this. And the way he's pursuing this conflict is a way that keeps it contained to Ukraine. He's at war with the collective West, literally. Every day we have Western leaders come up with, more innovative way to kill Russian troops. Think about it. We're going to give them the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Wow. Okay, 50. Maybe it'll grow. The numbers will grow. All you've done is guarantee that every Ukrainian that touches the Bradley will die, but the Russians who are going to be killing the Bradley are going to die too. So you've increased the scope and scale of the conflict and the human cost of the conflict. We're going to give them the Marder infantry fighting vehicle. Again, all you've guaranteed is that Ukrainians will die, Russians will die. We want to give them the Leopard tank. All you've done is guarantee that more Ukrainians die, more Russians die. You will not change the outcome. A lesser leader, when confronted with this constant escalation, would match escalation with escalation, and then we'd end up with a general war. Vladimir Putin's not doing that. He's being attacked mercilessly by allegedly pro-Russian bloggers. You know, he's a coward, he's a weak man, he's this, he's that, he's the other thing. Actually, showing restraint in time of war is the greatest virtue anybody could have. It's the greatest measure of courage. A brave man knows when not to attack, when not to needlessly sacrifice human lives. You know, a coward overreacts, throws forces in when you don't need to because I want to look good, I want to look tough. The toughest man is the one who can shoulder that burden, pay the price, bear that burden gracefully, even though it means people will attack him for appearing weak. A tough man is never afraid to appear weak when, by appearing weak, you're actually strengthening your cause. You know, I just have the highest regard for this guy, Vladimir Putin. I think he's done a great job. He's doing a great job. And I think the world owes him a debt of gratitude that he'll never get, by the way. We'll never, ever, ever give Vladimir Putin the credit he deserves for this. But I don't think he's looking for that credit. But I want the Russian people to understand that you're lucky, you're fortunate to have a leader like this. You could have had somebody else. And I don't think things would be going as well.
I want to say two things on that note, Scott. First, when you mentioned the Nobel Prize, I could care less about existence of it. If they gave it to Obama twice, who is the one who deserves anything but the Peace Prize? That's my opinion, okay? Yeah. So to me, that could stop just existing and it doesn't matter at all. But a second thing, when you were talking about this, I had this vision, this very simple understanding that there are old rich men who are throwing young men on the battlefield for their own whatever interest. And could it be just, let's meet in one room, let's have this whatever we are having issues, I don't know, why they don't fight one another? I know I'm talking like this now, but why they don't have this in a nice, fancy, schmancy room with all the top luxury stuff, have this conversation, so thousands and hundreds of thousands of people in the world, and this is on and on and on. All this concept of war is dead.
Well, they tried that. They tried it. Minsk. Angela Merkel was driven to tears. She wanted all of our sympathy about how she flew here, she flew there, she did everything. She did everything. The hardest moments of her life, we were told, in implementing an act of duplicity, extreme duplicity. She stared Vladimir Putin in the eyes and lied to him. Remember, Minsk isn't just a violation of the trust with Russia. It's a violation of trust with the world because they took the Minsk Accords to the Security Council of the United Nations and they gave it the stamp of approval of the Security Council. So they betrayed the world. So, you know, Merkel, and by extension, it's Germany. I'm sorry, she's a German leader and the German people should be outraged. I mean, if they're not in the streets demonstrating about this to hold her to account, then it means that they're complicit in it. It means that they accept it, that they approve of it. The same thing with the French. You know, if they're not demanding that Hollande be arrested and prosecuted for being a war criminal, then they're complicit in this, in the deception. And the same thing in the United States. I could walk through the beautiful quiet of my town and nobody cares, nobody knows, nobody understands. Nobody's going to hold anybody to account. So again, I believe the Russians, if they had a viable negotiating partner, would do so because, and they would do so in a manner, and we know this, we know that they were prepared to accept a peace settlement on April 1st when they were negotiating in Istanbul. They were preparing to accept something that was far less than what they have now, far less. It would have preserved the Zelensky government, preserved the Ukrainian military. You know, it would have, you know, of course, secured Donbass and Crimea, but it was far less than what's going on now. Russia was willing to do that. And at that time, that would have been a very, very difficult settlement for Putin to explain to the Russian people. But it's one that he was prepared to accept, to bring an end to this war, But Boris Johnson flew to Kiev and stopped it, shut it down, scuttled it, because the West isn't interested in peace. Who is Russia to negotiate with? Who is Russia to negotiate with? There's no one to negotiate with. There's no one they can trust. No one, not a single one they can trust. So now, confronted with that, Putin has no choice but to tell his military leadership to get on with the task, knowing the human cost that's going to be paid by the Russian soldiers and the Russian families by extension, and the Russian nation by extension. The burden of command, the burden of leadership. It's an unbearable burden, but he's bearing it with grace, the grace and dignity that his Western counterparts are incapable of displaying.
They show the real values, right, Scott? Those European leaders, the values.
Values and the Americans as well. I mean, we're disgusting.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. The people, I love the American people. I love the potential of the American nation. But the people we elect, the people we elect to represent us in IRA are just literally the most disgraceful people on the planet. There's no redeeming qualities, no redeeming values. They stand for nothing but money, enrichment, and power. And they're willing to sacrifice everything to achieve that.
So the last question will be, I just had a recently conversation with Andrei Martianov, and I have asked him about how does he see the future of Russia? I don't think I ever asked you this. How do you see the future of Russia?
How do I see the future of Russia? I think Russia is going to go through a phase of isolationism, where it, from the time of Peter the Great, Russia reached out to the West, wanted to be a part of the West, wanted to be part of Europe. And that desire became part of the Russian soul, so to speak. And there has been a betrayal of Russia by the West, rapid betrayal, economic betrayal, political betrayal, every kind of betrayal. This goes beyond, everybody's like, well, wait a minute, they were invaded by the Germans in World War II. Yes, they were invaded by Nazi Germany, but they were allied with the West, with the United States, Great Britain, France. It's not as though the West rejected Russia. Germany invaded, but together with the West, the Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany. And even during the Cold War, there wasn't this sense that the West was trying to cancel Russia. They were just, trying to get Russia to buy into a rules-based international order that the Soviet Union wasn't, but they weren't canceling Russia. Yeah. I think there's, right now, Russia has realized that the cancel culture in the West has reached such a scope and scale that we're seeking to cancel Russia. Now, some people have known this. I mean, Vladimir Putin has spoken about, what the Chechen wars were about. And I mean, anybody who studies, especially the Second Chechen War, knows that Russia knows what the United States and Europe was doing, how we were facilitating the transfer of, money, weapons, and fundamental Islamic ideology into Chechnya for the sole purpose of defeating Russia and beginning a process of dismemberment of Russia. The idea was that if we could get Chechnya to be declared an independent nation, to break away, that Dagestan would fall, Ingushetia would fall, the mountain states in Caucasus would all fall. And then you'd have this cascade as the Bashkirs and the Tatars and the Udmurts and the Buryats and everybody else broke away. And so the Russian Federation collapsed into this competing fiefdoms of chaos and anarchy, which would be disastrous for the people involved. But in the West, we'd go, great, that's what we want, because we don't care about the Russians. I mean, that's the ultimate thing. We don't care about the Russian people. We don't view them as humans on the scale of Europe. See, Russia wants to be part of Europe, so that when you put a Russian next to a German, we go equal. But that's not what's happening. We now put any European up there and we put a Russian up and we say people that are of our stature, inferior people, the Russians. That's the way the Western approach is. And so I think Russia, the Western policy of sanctioning Russia is sort of a gift to Russia. And what I mean by that is it compelled Russia to confront this horrific reality that the West isn't their friends. The West doesn't view them as fellow human beings of equal status, that the West will always view Russia as inferior, at least the West, the way it's currently configured. So I think you're going to see Russia turning back within itself. And this is the scary part, because nationalism is always a very dangerous thing. And, if you force Russia to turn in on itself, it may redefine itself in a manner which, well, I'll just say, isn't reflective of real Russian values. Because real Russian values are values that have them reaching out to other people, trying to live peacefully, coexist with people. And if Russia becomes an isolationist nation, it's going to reject that. And then that tends to exaggerate certain features of Russian history, features of Russian society, and de-emphasize others. And so I think Russia's going to be going through a very, very difficult time. I think economically they'll do okay. I think that their pivot to the east is okay. But I don't see Russia integrating with China the same way Russia sought to integrate with the West. No matter how close relations are going to be between Russia and China, it's never going to be, the kind of, hey, we want to be part of China. First of all, Russia is very concerned about China's size in terms of the population, especially in the Far East, where there's a lot of territory that, the fears that China could seek to move in and absorb Russia. And so Russia is very concerned about that. So I think Russia will be turning inward everywhere. And this is going to be a challenge for Russia. It's truly going to be one of those historic, challenges of a nation. How will Russia survive the decades of isolationism that's going to occur? The imposed isolationism of the West and the cultural isolation of that there's just the reality of Russia interacting with the East. And it's going to be one of Russia's greatest challenges, I think, as a nation, because we're talking about the Russian people, the Russian nation. We're talking about, a nation that had, with the history of, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tchaikovsky. All those people I just named were Western focused. So the basic heart and soul of Russia is always oriented towards the West. Always oriented to the West. To the extent that they're oriented to the East, it's a rejection of the Golden Horde. It's a rejection of the Mongol conquest. That's the relationship with the East is it has that. The relationship with the West is to absorb German culture, to absorb French culture. To the East, to reject the Golden Horde, to reject the Mongol hordes. And now Russia's going to have to redefine itself. And how they do that's going to be one of the greatest challenges for the Russian nation. Militarily, Russia will do just fine, just fine. Economically, Russia's going to do just fine. But the military and the economy doesn't define Russia. That's not who Russia is. That's not what Russia is. And so I'm very concerned about it, because the Russia that I love is the Russia that's defined by its history, its culture, its traditions, its values. And those values are close to mine because Russia has always said we want to be part of the West. And so there's an inherent kinship. But if Russia, not beginning, I'm not blaming Russia for this. It's not Russia's fault. Russia's had no choice, but they're going to have to put up these walls to protect them. And I'll say this. Russia went through a similar period of time when they were part of the Soviet Union. When you study the early years of Soviet history, you know, the Soviet Union was literally surrounded by hostile parties, hostile nations. They had no friends, and they had to rely upon themselves. And a lot of mistakes were made. This is the time of Stalin. You know, so the mistakes were made. You have to look at these mistakes in a historical context. Therefore, but Russia redefined itself during that period of time, but it didn't forget its roots. It didn't forget its roots, even though, you know, Homo Sovieticus was created, the Russian man, and all this stuff. The Russian man was never delinked from Tolstoy, never delinked from Dostoevsky, never delinked from Tchaikovsky. And I just hope that whatever emerges, the new Russian man, and I don't mean to be sexist, by man, I mean nation, the new Russian nation never delinks itself from that which makes it so unique and possessing of so much value to the world. You know, so I'm concerned. I'm nervous. I'm afraid for the Russian people. Not that they're going to be defeated by anybody, but that they'll defeat themselves. And so this is going to be one of the greatest tests going forward for the Russian people and the Russian nation, how they can survive this calamity that's been thrust upon them. And we'll see. But I'm optimistic to a point, but I'm also realistic because, as I told you, I'm a human. And I know what human nature is, and I know how bitter I can be, and I know how angry I can get, and I know how revenge-filled I can get. And this is going to be a huge test for the Russian people and the Russian nation not to allow the circumstances that they've been thrust into through no fault of their own to embitter them, to anger them, fill them with revenge, to fill them with hate, to fill them with a desire to transform into something that they're not. It's going to be a big test for the people of Russia.
Thank you for sharing this, Scott. But, you know, I would like to add something from me now.
Sure.
In reference to this. Because I absolutely see what you're saying. I understand this point very well. But maybe because I'm here now and I'm observing the people and I'm interacting with people, I think this is on the spiritual level. What's going to happen is, well, first of all, I see still that the faith in Russia is very strong. I see it by people going to the churches, and I see it. I just see how they are faithful. So the faith is one factor, but I also think, looking at this, it was comparing it like to a relationship, let's say between men and women, and either way, men looking up to a woman, idolizing it, or a woman looking up to a partner, idolizing this partner. So we have East and West. And now Russia, let it be male or female, coming to understand of her own virtues and strengths. And she was looking for something that seemingly was better, more elevated on another level, when in fact that was full of envy and jealousy and insecurity because she had it all. So it's like a very, very twisted version of it. And now I think it will be full circle. Russia is coming back to rediscovering all those strengths and abilities, and not just resources, but on the spiritual level, because it is really in people, and you know this, and I know you know this. It's in people. It's something you cannot, you're born with this. So anyway.
No, Anya, I agree with you, but I also, I watch Russian TV, the talk shows. I listen to Russian politicians, and there are elements out there that that are promoting very nationalistic postures and policies that that don't match the what you just the Russia you just described.
Heartfelt, right?
Right.
So
It's more
like,
visceral. It's more human.
Yeah.
It's more muscle bound. And that's the struggle I think that Russia is going to be going through, because I don't dispute anything you just said. And the irony is even under Stalin, the church, the Orthodox Church, was seen. I think he gave a speech in October of 1941 where he appealed to the Russian nation, the Russian people, the Russian church, to save the Soviet Union. So in the darkest times, Stalin knew who he had to appeal to save Soviet Union. It was the Russian people, the narod, and what makes the people, not just the earth, but the spirit, the faith in the church. And so I think you're absolutely correct to bring that up. But understand that there are people out there who can abuse spirituality. We've seen it in history. The Crusades, jihad. The world is full of faith being used for the wrong purposes. And again, I'm not saying that Russia is going to go in that path. I just think that it's going to be a struggle. I don't think that I can't guarantee an outcome. And one of the reasons is probably because I'm here in the United States, and so I don't have day-to-day contact, and I don't see this, see what you're seeing. But just as an outside observer, I just fear for the coming struggle that I think is going to take place of an existential nature within the Russian soul. And I just pray that the Russians will emerge the same people that they are today, stronger, better, more confident, but inside, the same people. Because that's what makes them great. That's what makes them great.
Thank you so much again, Scott, for coming on today. Can you show us the cover of your book again? Because you've written many books. It's behind you, right? I just want, because someone mentioned that the links were not working. So I just want to make sure. Okay, wow. Okay, so you can purchase this book. It's down below. You have the links, and if they are not working, they should be working, because I attached last time. You can buy through Amazon or directly from the publisher as well.
From Clarity Press.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
And then that's it. And then the other thing is, I do other writing besides the book, and I put it out on ScottRitterExtra.com. So you can get other things there too. And for instance, this podcast, when you're kind enough to link it to me, we'll put it there too for people to see.
Thank you, Scott. And also on Telegram, people can follow, not on Twitter,
Telegram?
Everyone. Twitter,
No, I'm back on Twitter.
Again?
Yesterday, they let me on. I don't know. Is it a mistake? Who knows? But so
I am always right after you back. So this is second time. And then tomorrow you will be gone again.
Well, see, I'm researching an article on that takes on the New York Times most recent take on Bucha. And Bucha seems to be my Achilles heel. So as soon as I publish that article, damn, they're going to take me down again. So we'll see what happens. But the real Scott Ritter Twitter account is back up, the original one. So we'll see how long that lasts. All
right. So I will find that if it still exists, and I put the link down below, and also Telegram and YouTube channel where Scott interviews other guests as well. I think that's it. Anything else to mention, Scott, to find you? I think those are all the platforms, right?
That's it. The only thing I'd say is, again, Happy New Year. And I don't know, are you Orthodox?
No.
Okay, because I think the Orthodox just had the Orthodox Christmas, and they have the Orthodox New Year coming up. So we're still in the holiday season. So I just wish everybody a very happy and fruitful holiday season.
And S Nowym Godem.
S Nowym Godem.
Thank you so much, everyone, for
Sprazdnikom.
watching. We really appreciate Scott and all his expertises and sharing his knowledge. So yeah, until next time, and it won't be in Russia, our next conversation.
But maybe the one after that. We never know.
You'll never know. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you.